I apologise, by the way, in advance if my voice is slightly off. I can't really tell, but if it is, I apologise. So, I mean, I suppose I would welcome all of you, even though I know all of you. You've come to listen to me prattle for the next 4 hours, 4.5 hours. So I suppose I would sort of begin with a brief preamble as to the reason that this series of teachings, these 3 teachings, or a sort of long sort of workshop, whatever you'd like to call it, conceived of really as 3 teachings, sort of one after the other, as to why I have structured this sort of event in this way. And I suppose there were a few sort of considerations that bore on this decision. Firstly was a realization quite quickly when I attempted months ago, when I sort of conceived of trying to address the question of Ireland and the left, way back even in May of last year, was that there are quite a lot of particular sort of problems. Firstly, there's the sort of in some ways intentional lack of any prior knowledge of any kind on the subject, which would have to be grappled with, particularly among young students, as well as excuse me, in a sense the particular that in some ways the question of Ireland is in some ways firstly a question about Britain, but is in some ways the most acute manifestation of the crisis of bourgeois society, at least historically, in Britain, and the particular fact then that the history bears on the present in a way that I suppose is particularly obscure in the present, but also, or particularly obscure I should say, more broadly, i.e. students say here, in the present, and yet is sort of more evident. And so there was in a sense more to grapple with. So I suppose that's the first sort of broad consideration. So the second was, or sort of related to this, was the fact that I would have initially sort of ideally planned to have a panel on the subject, and I would still plan to do this. But I also felt that this would be there would need to be a sort of either relationship between how one would prepare for the panel, and the panel itself would be difficult for this reason. Excuse me. And then more recently, this is a slightly more ethereal, concern of mine. That's just more recently I have, firstly going through the earlier parts of the first section, if you will, of the Platypus reading group last year, I was struck by the sort of disparities between the sort of knowledge among Platypus members, and particularly younger members, on the sort of deeper history of the bourgeois revolution in Britain in particular, and the sort of how this what the sort of connections between these sort of the bourgeois revolution and the crisis of capitalism, and even like the emergence of Bonapartism in Britain, how it relates to the left, particularly in the 20th century. That all of this is like quite obscure. And I was struck by, I found this in particular when, that this is a sort of, I think more, it's something that has been, we've been aware of for a while, and it's like partially sparked the, impulses towards, doing teachings on like Chartism, or there have been, discussions of doing one on like, the, if you will, the British Revolution before. These sort of are a result more of our growth in the UK. That these sort of educational needs like present themselves. And I felt that, given the particular way in which one has to bear like all of this history in mind when discussing the question of Ireland and the left, it would be perhaps a sort of useful but also a judicious way of addressing this like educational need without getting too perhaps bogged down in like the detail. Though of course that wouldn't preclude and shouldn't preclude in any way specific teachings or other events on any of these other like topics. And then I suppose as to why I decided to do this like teaching now specifically. I mean, there were a few more concrete ones, obviously. I suppose the first being the some of the stuff around like this issue has come up again with like Brexit, and has, if not on the left, and I think that's something that we might discuss later on as to why it hasn't appeared particularly prescient on the left, but certainly in like politics more broadly.
The Irish question
has been more in the sort of has become more prescient in a way that it wouldn't have been a few years ago. Excuse me. Which both sort of compels me in one sense to, this is a broader point, this is sort of a compulsion on my part to teach rather than, I suppose, an interest in the sort of typical sense of the word. I usually try to, as Joyce put it, escape the nightmare of history. And usually pretend that none of this exists and that I can sail along happily and not worry about it. But anyway, I have found myself like these different considerations being sort of like compelled to at least give an attempt at this, I suppose. And I suppose two other brief points that spurred me to give this like presentation now was firstly the there has been, I think, a broader discussion or an encountering in Platypus recently with the question of like the national question more broadly, and I think this is the question of Ireland and the left is a particularly good way perhaps to get at this problem, and I thought that this might be beneficial in that regard more broadly, as well as excuse me, the fact that Platypus has also in a slightly more broader sense been aware of the need to like fill in more of the sort of broader history, the deeper history more generally, and there has been discussion of say a panel on like the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries as particular topics and sort of are you looking for?
I'm just making sure that's recording.
Oh, that's okay.
Stick this up over the top.
Okay, don't worry.
Continue.
so there's been this like broader need to like address this deeper history, and once again, as I said, in like preparing like to address this topic, once it became apparent that I couldn't, do it in, one teaching, a 25-minute presentation, an hour of questions or whatever, or even a longer presentation like the one on Mark Fisher would still be insufficient. I decided to sort of experiment slightly with, this idea of having, excuse me, of addressing this like deeper history through doing 3 linked but still like distinct teachings addressing broadly the sort of broadly the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, or as they are in the the flyer, the poster, the Bourgeois Revolution and Ireland, Marxism in Ireland, and Ireland and the Death of the Left. And I wish then to experiment with this as like a format to see essentially how it works and what might be, if it might be something worth reproducing in relation to like other questions in the future, particularly in the lead up to the international convention in a couple of weeks. I thought it would be good to get it over now, so it could possibly be reflected upon then, if I may have the temerity to suggest such a thing. So, I suppose that's a broader preamble to why I decided to do this presentation in this way, and presumably why you're like here. So, I suppose then we should begin with the first of these teachings then, the Bourgeois Revolution and Ireland, which I have given the dates of 1603 to 1841, both of which are slightly, obviously, there's an element of these are dates obviously aren't quite as neat and tidy as that, but I think there's a good schema involved. So I suppose to sort of start then with 1603. 1603 is the year that James VI of Scotland is crowned King of England and Ireland as well. King James I in the Union of the Crowns, as it's known. And this is the sort of in the very early part of like James I's reign is the sort of the completion of what you may call sometimes like the reconquest, though perhaps more accurately, I think Marx puts it this way, it will be the first conquest of Ireland, which really begins in the 1640s beginning under Henry VIII. This is the completion really of
1540s.
Right. Yes. The completion of this conquest of Ireland, and it's really also because it's with this, like the completion, that really history sort of, begins essentially. When you're talking about Irish history, everything which precedes this becomes much more ethereal, and seems to have very little like bearing upon the present in any way. Excuse me. So you start then with the as at the end of or the completion of this like first conquest of Ireland, and one of the things which defines this is various in this like period is like various plantations or attempted plantations of English, and later then obviously after James I, importantly, Scottish settlers in Ireland as loyal sort of subjects. And most notably, the most famous example is the plantation of Ulster from 1609 to officially 1612. And this is a replacement in a sense. Really, this is the sort of like the culmination of the, if you will, the bourgeois, like the emergence of bourgeois society in Ireland. In that the old sort of like, feudal sort of Gaelic like chieftains are sort of replaced by, even if like the these like chieftains themselves are like remain, the whole sort of structure of like society becomes centered around bourgeois social relations. I.e., all of these chieftains are granted like, if you will, if you will, like official like landed titles under sort of a new system of like under a new like legal system essentially. But what's important to bear in mind, and this is a point which sort of pertains to everything from this point onwards, which is to give an obvious example, that the relationship between, if you will, like the majority of people and even these like, landlords, which is the point is that these people are tenants and they relate to landlords as opposed to feudal peasants. You're bound through essentially a sort of like feudal contract to various chieftains or lords and so on. So this is really the sort of the culmination of excuse me. The culmination of this conquest is the emergence of bourgeois society, which is also why it is in a sense also the beginning of history. So, excuse me. So there are broadly, this is, I should also say, importantly, what's important also to bear in mind about this, these like plantations and the conquest is the emergence of, there are different names, but you have what are sometimes called like the Old Irish, i.e. the sort of old Gaelic sort of people who might have lived there like before even the Norman invasions way back in the Middle Ages, all of whom would be, say, predominantly, well, almost exclusively Catholic and Gaelic, and then you would have there is another group importantly at this period, which is something called the Old English, who are also predominantly Catholic, also largely sort of Gaelicized, Anglo-Normans living in Ireland at this time. And then with these like plantations, you have what are sometimes called the New English, who are almost entirely Protestant. They're typically, though there is a slight sort of excuse me. Excuse me. There is obviously importantly that within this there are like distinctions between importantly like Anglican sort of English settlers and more sort of Presbyterian Scottish settlers. This is, I suppose, a sort of broad setting of the scene, I suppose, around this time in, say, 1603. obviously with most of this is like consolidated under James the First. It's also but then as you sort of move along to Charles the First, obviously you have the outbreak of you often call the English Civil War, though this is a sort of really a sort of subset of or one like part of what is more broadly called like the War of the Three Kingdoms, i.e. those being England, Scotland and Ireland, in which there are like I won't like go into a great deal of detail about this period, roughly 1641 to 1660. I mean, these are three quite distinct sort of political entities in which there are, three distinct sort of dynamics at play, and sort of shifting alliances and perspectives within each of these sort of within each of the kingdoms, and obviously between them, is quite complex. And we wouldn't really have the, and it would take a great deal of time to sort of unpick them. I suppose the only a few points I would make is that it's here where you begin to see the sort of emergence of firstly you have the, if you will, the aligning almost entirely of the interests of as I said, the Old Irish and the Old English, predominantly Catholic and predominantly Gaelic, coalesce into more or less one sort of political force. Then you have the sort of Anglican or Puritan at this point, like English sort of parliamentary sort of political excuse me, project, and a sort of, if you will, like a Presbyterian Scottish one, and these are sort of broadly, though not exclusively, the three sort of political tendencies which then sort of both first emerge really in like the 1640s, which then like persist then up really into like the 19th century. But as I said, the this sort of broader period of say 1641 to 1660 is something we shouldn't touch on too lightly. Firstly, for there's only a couple of points I would say. Firstly, I would sort of excuse me, simply sort of note that from this, Cromwell emerges as the sort of like arch villain of Irish history. As to whether that is, justified as a sort of, slightly different point. But he is the sort of like villain and this figure who sort of hangs over Irish history in one sense. I would also say, just briefly on this point, that as a side point, Marx once wrote that it is in the conquest of Ireland, i.e. in the midst of this period, that the Cromwell lost the English Republic, which is important because, of course, in 1660, with the restoration of Charles II and the sort of, all of the sort of problems of, if you will, this like first attempt at a bourgeois revolution in Britain, all remain sort of in play and have not been resolved. Excuse me. And they're only then really sort of come to fruition later with the Glorious Revolution in 1688. So,
where does Marx write that about Cromwell and the English Revolt?
it's in a sort of notes he wrote for like a speech he was going to give to the the educational, communist educational body, I think, of the International Working Men's Association in 1867 on Ireland. That's why it's sort of it's not like in one of his published works. I think these are sort of notes he sort of compiled for a speech which wasn't, I think, in the end delivered. Excuse me. So obviously the Glorious Revolution is the culmination of the bourgeois revolution in Britain. And again, as I said, this sort of it's really the culmination of all of the sort of previous demands for excuse me, the sort of political manifestations of bourgeois society and of bourgeois freedom that emerged earlier in the 17th century. So it begins obviously with the ascension of James II to all three thrones in 1685, and his quite sort of conservative approach to the governance of the three kingdoms is particularly, there's the whole list of issues, but the extra parliamentary sort of or the subversion of sort of Parliament in relation to raising a standing army or excuse me, the passage of laws without parliamentary approval and so on. That really prompts the Whigs in Parliament to invite his daughter, excuse me, and her husband, William, Prince of Orange, to be jointly crowned, the king and queen, and in exchange for they have to agree to what's called the Bill of Rights, which is essentially a sort of a list of sort of demands limiting the power of the monarchy and creating essentially the sort of constitutional monarchy and the basis for the sort of modern British constitutional settlement. Excuse me. However, there is both opposition to the Glorious Revolution in Scotland, and then particularly in Ireland you have the outbreak of the brief Williamite War, again between I should also say that if I did believe I did that James II was a Catholic, and the question of religion is still live, and he's supported then largely by excuse me, he attempts to raise essentially a Catholic army in Ireland to retake the throne, and is defeated. And after this, you have the strengthening of what are called penal laws. The emergence broadly of of the sort of like social hierarchy which sort of persists then throughout the 18th century, which is that of the, it's broadly called the Protestant ascendancy. The three broad groups being Anglican Protestant sort of landlords, predominantly, sort of dissenters, which is sort of various other non-conformist Protestant sects, most notably large numbers of excuse me, Scottish Presbyterians who emigrate, and there's another influx of these after the Glorious Revolution in like the 1690s, and then Catholics, and both Catholics and dissenters are both largely disenfranchised, or almost entirely disenfranchised, by the official Anglican ascendancy sort of social and political order. Excuse me. And this sort of, there are sort of various reasons behind this. One being that though the Pope had, for example, initially supported the William's claim, he later sort of switched sides to supporting a Stuart restoration, i.e. to restore James II and later his son to the throne, which persists up until sort of mid 1760s. And even though the dissenters were largely in favour of the Glorious Revolution as well, they're also sort of excluded. Anyway, however, though you have, so this sort of persists particularly through the first half of the 18th century. Excuse me. But as the sort of century progresses, you have the sort of the increasing emergence of a sort of a liberal, if you will, like bourgeois opposition to this sort of like social structure and political structure. Excuse me. Particularly, Marx calls he says that the North American Revolution is the first turning point in Irish history, in that it has as many of the supporters of the American Revolution in Britain, it has a sort of liberalising effect, particularly with the obviously more broadly to the the emergence of, if you will, like the consciousness of bourgeois society as such, which transcends, in a sense, the previous sort of religious understanding which had like persisted up until this point, as well as the so you have the lifting of many of these like restrictions, which had been particularly in the sort of the 1780s. You have firstly the establishment of what's called Grattan's Parliament, excuse me, which is where, i.e. that all of the laws passed by the Irish Parliament, which was of course a separate kingdom at this point, had to be sort of approved by Parliament in Westminster. This sort of requirement is like removed, and so you have the beginning of the sort of like lifting of these restrictions on both dissenters and Catholics.
Why is that?
Why in like what sense? I mean, there's two.
Well, you've said that it's kind of an after effect of the American Revolution.
Well, I mean, there are, if you will, if there are like two sort of answers, I suppose. One is the particular sort of like needs of the day, which is that the excuse me, the defeats in like the initial defeats in like 1776 and 1777 in the colonies necessitate the sending of like the army that would usually be stationed in like the Kingdom of Ireland to the colonies, and thus the need for greater involvement by other sort of groups in the sort of like local like militias and so on. More broadly, though, it's again, as I think I already mentioned, the the coming to like consciousness of bourgeois society as such, i.e., the emergence of the notion that people are simply you would have a lot of you would have like increasing like sort of commentaries about the sort of like modest, industrious nature of Catholics and dissenters who particularly sort of the emergence of a sort of like Presbyterian like middle class engaged in a lot of commerce, manufacturing and so on. I.e., so it's the emergence of the fact that bourgeois freedom is something that you simply like pursue through labour, which is something universally sort of applicable. And when you see this emerging, particularly in the sort of like both in the lead up to the American Revolution, or the North American Revolution, as Marx calls it, and particularly afterwards, this becomes like a sort of there's like a greater like impetus to sort of liberalise Britain more broadly, because it's felt, of course, that the colonies wouldn't have seceded if a more sort of liberal like approach had been adopted. Excuse me. So this sort of persists, throughout the 1780s and into the like early 1790s. You have obviously the French Revolution in 1789, which has, if you will, both a greater radicalizing effect on the sort of like increasingly sort of like bourgeois sort of liberal like various factions in Ireland. So it's in 1790 that you have the founding of what's known as the United Irishmen, which is it goes through different phases, but it is a society initially for both to unite, obviously, Irishmen of all like denominations, under one like to constitute them as like a nation, as opposed to as like denominations, and to establish initially a sort of independent and independent, and increasingly independent like Irish Parliament, but still under the sort of like the Crown. But then after the declaration of war between Britain and France in 1793, this shifts to a much more radical, secular republicanism. Complete separation of church and state. Checks and balances, republican government. The emergence of the question of even universal suffrage, so on. Excuse me. However, this, the effect of the French Revolution in Britain, though, is one of the reasons if someone like, say, Edmund Burke, for example, supported the American Revolution but opposed the French Revolution, was they saw the American Revolution as having a sort of liberalising effect in Britain, but the French Revolution as having a sort of conservative effect.
Destabilised.
A destabilised. And in Ireland, this is most sort of apparent because with the sort of like increased sort of radicalism of these bourgeois sort of revolutionaries at this point, they sort of seek aid from France to establish this independent republic, and so there's a need then to like there was a failed sort of abortive attempt in 1796 with the French attempt to land, but did all sort of bad weather and gets in the way, and the sort of whole plan falls apart. And then from this point on, you have a real like crackdown, the establishment of martial law, and there is then an attempted sort of like rebellion in 1798, which is crushed, and it's from this that you have the emergence of an idea which had been posited several times before, but which then comes to fruition in the wake of this like rebellion, which is the union of Ireland with Britain, and I should also say, importantly, very importantly, I should say, that obviously you have initially these three kingdoms in the British Isles, all of which are they're three like separate political legal entities, but the same person sort of wears all three hats, I suppose. But obviously in the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution, or even I should say, with the actual ascension initially of James I, you have the emergence of the idea of like merging these like political entities into one, unified, united kingdom. And I mean this is an idea which persists then. And at the start of the 18th century, you have the Act of Union in 1707 between the kingdoms of England and Scotland to form what then becomes the United Kingdom of Great Britain, which is important, I think, because of course, this sort of like Act of Union is, i.e. the sort of 1707 one, is essentially a sort of the idea behind this is that that these like two distinct nations can like cooperate and sort of benefit, like mutually benefit from a sort of this like closer political sort of alignment, to like facilitate commerce and free trade.
The single market.
Right. A lot of talk recently about the UK's internal single market as well. But I suppose it's important to like just bear in mind the bourgeois character of this union, and consequently there were, as I said, sort of various attempts to do the same thing with Ireland throughout the sort of 18th century, but it's only in the wake of the crushing of the 1798 rebellion that this becomes sort of like a necessity for the sort of British government sort of fighting the French. They see this as a sort of as having a separate political entity in this way, as sort of destabilizing and dangerous, and think that perhaps by a sort of pushing ahead with this sort of union, that the sort of these problems could be sort of solved in some way. Excuse me. It should also be noted that William Pitt had, of course, initially envisioned a sort of what they call full Catholic emancipation to sort of like immediately follow the Act of Union. This was sort of part of the idea, or a large part of the idea behind the Union sort of success. However, the sort of King George III refuses, as he argues it would violate his coronation vows, which also then collapses Pitt's ministry at the time.
What year is that?
That would be, the Act of Union starts 1801, I think. Pitt's ministry is a bit later.
Younger.
Pitt the Younger, yes. It's a bit later, it's I think 1802. And it's from this, of course, I guess a sort of side point that Pitt is the most ardent sort of like enemy of like the French Revolution. He's prepared to essentially perpetuate the war forever, because all of Britain's like continental allies have been like defeated at this point. It's from this that you have the sort of what's called the Year of Peace between Britain and Napoleon. First Consul Bonaparte at this point, I think. Anyway, however, this like emancipation doesn't take place, and you also have the with obviously the onset of the French Revolutionary Wars and later the Napoleonic Wars, you have the acceleration of the process of industrialization, which had already sort of been underway previous to this, and had already perhaps you could already see sort of manifestations. In the like 1780s, for example, you would have had you had the emergence of agrarian like defensive societies. You have like the Catholic defenders. This is in like Ulster, i.e. the sort of northernmost of Ireland's historical four provinces, most of which constitutes modern Northern Ireland, and where the particularly after the sort of emigrations of the 1690s and early 1700s, you have a sort of substantial sort of majority of largely Scottish Presbyterians, but the Protestant majority overall. You can see the in the 70s you have sort of escalating sort of violence between these different like defensive groups. You have the Catholic defenders and what are initially called the Peter Day Boys, which eventually sort of in 1795 coalesce into what becomes the Loyal Orange Institution, or it's more commonly called the Orange Order. Mainly over in Ulster at the time, it's the emergence of the linen industry. It's for access to essentially who will have like access to jobs in the linen industry, and obviously this sort of process of industrialization, which happens then with the Napoleonic Wars, sort of accelerates through the sort of early part of the 19th century. Excuse me. And these sort of problems then persist. There is still this like continuing demand for predominantly like Catholic emancipation, but there are also emancipation more broadly, i.e. the removal of restrictions on various denominations, Christian denominations, excuse me, holding public offices or standing for Parliament and so on.
Is there still a Republican movement following on from 1796 to 98 in this kind of early part of the 19th century, after the Napoleonic Wars?
There is a sort of another, even weaker sort of failed attempt in 1803, which also fails.
Are those Dublin based?
Well,
are they also in Ulster?
Well, they were based mainly in, the United Irishmen were founded initially in Belfast, in Ulster, obviously, largely by, the sort of, initially by sort of like predominantly Presbyterian sort of ministers and sort of commercial, people engaged in like commerce and so on, and a sort of like bourgeoisie in like Belfast. Though also there's like there are like two sort of major centres, those being Belfast and Dublin. Obviously in Dublin you have a much more sort of like broader like scattering. You would have obviously a large number of like obviously like bourgeois like Catholics as well. You also have various like liberal sort of with Protestant sort of bourgeoisie, and also a few like liberal members of the ascendancy as well. Landlords and so on. But I mean, it grows quite rapidly to. Excuse me. I mean, they initially see the, particularly the Catholic defenders, this like agrarian sort of secret society, as a sort of ready-made army for like revolution, and sort of form an alliance with them. And I think they grow. I think at a peak, I think at around like 260,000 members. Which would have been predominantly either sort of like Northern Presbyterians and Catholics, though obviously with it was a sort of I suppose the key point to bear in mind is that it does sort of in a sense supersede the question of religion with this the advent of like this bourgeois notion of the nation. To go back to your like earlier point, I mean it sort of dies off in the like early 19th century. I think it's dissolved, I think, in 1804, and there's nothing which immediately like replaces it. You have the sort of I mean you have from that point onwards you have really sort of two sort of main like political sort of themes, one being the sort of increased sort of like skirmishing over between different sort of like defensive organizations over control of linen and in particular, but more broadly about like land, excuse me, but also then you have the sort of continued like demand for emancipation, and in the 1820s you have the establishment of the what's called the Catholic Association by a man called Daniel O'Connell, who excuse me, and it's this sort of in a sense a quite new sort of like political form. It sort of works. Firstly, it sort of falls back quite directly on the organization of the Catholic Church as a means of like organizing, i.e. it sort of it has it's this like much larger like mass political sort of organization, but because it organizes through the Catholic Church quite more directly, as a sort of means of like collecting dues and sort of disseminating information and so on,
So is that in the 1830s?
No, it's 1820s. 1822 it's founded. Excuse me. And what would happen was, again, this like, a different like style. In other words, O'Connell would address what were known as like monster meetings, meetings that might have had like 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 or some times like more people in like attendance, as a means of like sort of whipping up sort of political fervor for like emancipation, as well as
thousands of people, hundreds of like 20,000 people.
Yeah, like I mean, I think one of the largest I think was like 200,000 people, and as a means of like it was a form of brinksmanship with particularly the sort of because after the fall of Pitt, Catholic emancipation is sort of is a hot issue in British politics more broadly. But since the end of the Napoleon wars, you had Lord Liverpool was Prime Minister, and he's essentially allowed everyone to have their own in his all of these Tories, essentially these Conservatives, to have their own sort of personal views, and sort of there's an attempt to sort of avoid coming down on one side or the other, because there are quite a lot of just high Tories, sort of landed aristocracy, in particular, very supportive of the Church of England, and opposed to emancipation. So you have the building up of this political sort of movement in the 1820s, which then culminates in 1828 with O'Connell himself standing for election and winning the seat, but being unable then to take his seat, which then forces a crisis. And you have, I think in 1828, you have Liverpool steps down due to illness, and then this problem, which had been sort of kept sort of under wraps, then emerges, and you sort of cycle through. I think there are 4 prime ministers in the space of 12 months. You end up with the Duke of Wellington becoming prime minister, who is himself a sort of a high Tory and opposed to emancipation, but then eventually sees the sort of he gives way in the end, because of sort of the fear of what would happen if it's refused, because of O'Connell sort of whipping up these huge meetings of people that couldn't be controlled. Excuse me.
I know you want to get through to
1841.
1841. We should move to kind of discussion and questions
a bit
soon.
Yes, I know. It's sort of the only thing that I would say is that obviously with you have the granting obviously of Catholic emancipation in 1829, and the previous year you had what's called the Test Act, which repeals the sort of these various laws against dissenters of various kinds, as well. But you also have the re-emergence of religion as this political category in a way which had appeared to at least have been that the bourgeois revolution appeared to have pointed beyond, and in the sort of then in the 1830s you have obviously the Great Reform Act of 1832, excuse me, and you have this situation in which you have what Marx calls the Irish Brigade, i.e. the sort of host of the O'Connellites who are elected in Ireland, keeping the Whigs in power throughout much of the 1830s and up till 1841. It's an agreement between what's known as the Litchfield House Compact, between the sort of O'Connell, the sort of Whigs, and the radicals in the Parliament. But you do see a sort of in the 1830s a sort of considerable shift, not only in terms of the obviously this agreement is conditional on the fact that the Whigs give preference, or preference sort of the interests of O'Connell and his followers in sort of government appointments and so on in Ireland, and pushing through reforms of various kinds. But there is a sort of also a broader shift in terms of how the state like manages the is like engaging with society in a way. You can see in this like the the beginning of the emergence of Bonapartism in Britain, although it becomes much more apparent with Peel's ministry from 1841 onwards, which is why I sort of stopped there. I mean, 1841 was a sort of as I said, that's sort of like a soft date, I suppose. So I mean, we can stop there. I have talked over long. Anyway, any questions, or if I... Rory?
Okay. I had a question about... I wanted to ask about your sort of account of how bourgeois society emerges in Ireland, and how that relates to colonialism in particular. So I guess like one of the things that kind of propels the rise of bourgeois society in Europe is like the gold rush in the colonies, right? And I guess the question is also relevant because like on the left today, like and in Ireland and on the Irish left for that matter, the kind of narrative is that like from the start, since like Henry VIII, since Cromwell, Ireland was like suppressed and exploited, but kind of is also on like ethnic religious kind of grounds. So I guess like so I guess I kind of wanted to like make that point like a bit more. I think the presentation did a good job of kind of complicating that. But I guess I want to make that a bit more kind of explicit, especially like with the in terms of like stuff that we read in Platypus as well. One of the things that kind of one of the people that seemed kind of most relevant to what you were talking about was Adam Smith. Right, this kind of especially this kind of distinction between like the different types of colonies. So like
Greek colonies and Roman
colonies. Greek and Roman, right? So like kind of colonies in which you have like I don't know, a kind of organic expansion of society across territory, Greek style, and then kind of Roman, like tribune extraction type colonies. So I guess like I wanted to like throw that into the mix, and like in what sense does Ireland kind of relate to that sort of Adam Smith perspective, and how does that like how does like the left kind of deal with that as well? Massive can of worms, I'm sorry.
No, don't worry. I mean, I think I suppose there's a few things I would say. I mean, firstly, when I was saying the emergence of like bourgeois society, I suppose in a, obviously you can also bracket, but we have to bracket in the sense, I suppose, the emergence of bourgeois society in, England, which is probably a different like question, which does like pertain to this in a certain way. But I suppose the point I was sort of making initially was that. Partially through like, I mean, if you take these like plantations, but even like before this, the whole sort of like, say previously you would say, perhaps I should sort of give us like the deeper point, which is that this emerges with the Tudors in like the 1640s, out of like, the 1540s, excuse me, yes. Out of obviously, I mean, there is like a religious point, which is that, if you go back to sort of like, the sort of Middle Ages, the Lordship of Ireland was a papal title granted to the Kings of England, initially as a means of sort of bringing the like independent sort of, like Catholic Church in Ireland, which had been, since the sort of like collapse of the Roman Empire, had been quite sort of independent and sort of
isolated.
Yes, and so this was partially by, from a papal perspective, this was a means of bringing the church under like papal control, and in England, it was initially to Henry II. It was a means by which he could get a troublesome Lord Strongbow out of the way for a while. There are like other points, but that's like the initial sort of, if you will, the sort of like legal sort of rationale behind it comes from. It comes from the Pope. So after the Reformation, Henry obviously is no longer like Lord of Ireland in this sense. So he like proclaims himself King of Ireland. But then there was also a sort of like both as a means of like consolidating his hold, as well as of like spreading the Reformation. He sort of that's the sort of the, if you will, like the start of the the Tudor conquest. So the point I was making was that with the sort of new like firstly, even if as it happened in some cases, you might have like during this conquest, you might have say old like Gaelic chiefs might be like granted like lordships in this way. It wasn't the sort of the sort of legal nature of that was like different. They were the sort of like people on their lands wouldn't have been like serfs. They were like tenants. This is like say the 1550s. Say this is like one way in which this is one point, but also then back to your point about like colonization. Obviously a lot of when the colonists like settle, they don't obviously like replace everyone. When they still need to sort of they still need all of this like agricultural like labor, and so they sort of like employ almost all of the sort of like natives, but the whole like structure of the sort of relationship is like changed, because of course if you will, like the land which might have been held by like a chief is like seized by like the crown, but then it's like sold off and sort of distributed in this like through various like it's bourgeois essentially. Cut a long story short, you would give, for example, like the rights to like settle the land to guilds in like London, say. This happens in like in Ulster, which is where Londonderry comes from. One of the sort of like the two like cities in like Ulster. The second one is Londonderry, and this is essentially where the land is like granted to like the London guilds, who then sort of like bring in or try to bring in like settlers and sort of construct this whole like system of like dividing up land into these like portions, and sort of people could like buy land, or sort of they would sort of they would like settle and then sort of like pay back the sort of, if you were like a loan, and there were sort of like different approaches, but it's really even these sort of like structures still sort of ended up like scooping up like all the sort of like native like Irish anyway, because there weren't like you didn't have enough like settlers sort of turning up, partly because you had like already at the same time you have like the discovery of like the New World and the establishment of the the Virginia Company to set up colonies in the Americas, which drew a lot of prospective settlers who might like otherwise have come to Ireland. And I suppose though the problem then with the left is, or is that it's sort of, firstly, what I've like described, I suppose, is different to a sort of like the type of like standard sort of argument you would hear now about like exploitation in that way. In that I think it's, I suppose maybe a simple way of using like Smith's terms is that in the sense that both are sort of at play at the same time, both types of colonialism, and the problem of like exploitation, because there is obviously a lot of like this is like a sort of complicated point, but you do have like the emergence in like the 18th century of like with the beginning of the emergence of like manufacturing in Ireland more broadly, as opposed to simply in like Ulster. But then after like the Act of Union, this is all like destroyed, and something similar happened in like the mid like 17th century as well. I.e. between, if you will, like Cromwell and the Glorious Revolution, the Restoration monarchy. But the problem of like exploitation is really, in that way, something which is like projected backwards from, the sort of, the standpoint of like capitalism. Because there are like, and that is part of the sort of rationale behind like sort of the 1798 rebellion is, they sort of list all the sort of like as of course they do in like the American colonies as well. The sort of like tyrannies, and the all the sort of various things that have been done in the previous, say, like 200 years, around like religious discrimination and seizure of land and sort of protectionist sort of policies towards even like the importation of Irish goods into like England and Wales and so on. That's all like there, but I suppose that's different to the point about exploitation, which emerges later and which flattens sort of like historical distinctions. I don't know if that's like I don't know if that clarifies.
I think one thing there is what's peculiar about this period, and in this kind of second half of what you're talking about, is the emergence of the concept of the left.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So in the Norman conquest of Ireland, there's no idea of that there being a left in the struggle of the indigenous people to resist Normanization, nor even really in the
17th century.
Well, I was going to say, nor under Henry VIII.
Oh yes.
The Reformation is a kind of peculiar question because it obviously does usher in crucial aspects of bourgeois society in a quite profound way that obviously point towards the freedoms that are then emerging in civil society, and the collapse of the control of the Catholic Church over England and Ireland as well. But it's not clear, then that there's a kind of a left. Maybe we can say in the English Civil War and the English Revolution that a concept of a left emerges, and that's why it's possible to say something like that that line you quoted from Marx, that Cromwell loses the English Republic in Ireland. That there's this kind of idea that within the dynamic of the English Revolution, there was a left and right position within the revolution.
Right.
That Cromwell could have become a right revolutionary in some way, however obscure what that might have meant is. And so I guess what the projection back in a kind of tradition, in a more contemporary left narrative of the colonization of Ireland by the English, which becomes this kind of millennia-old question of oppression, is that the emergence of the left as a concept disappears. But one of the strange things then is this kind of way in which the emergence of liberalism as a political kind of theory and practice in England. That the English Revolution has this, and the bourgeois, as a bourgeois revolution per se, has this inexorable drive to the universal. Right? You can't maintain, even though the revolution is for England, and specifically they established the Republic of England. Right? It's not Scotland, and Wales is, but not.
Well, Wales is
Wales is not really Wales, in a way.
Well, I mean, Wales is like the Principality of Wales was actually as a legal entity subsumed into the Kingdom of England under Henry VIII as well.
Yeah.
So it's already like part of England.
It's part of England, yeah. But there's this way in which it then has to engage Scotland and Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
And it can't just engage it in the way of, well, we need to go there and put down the Catholic armies and then retreat to our English Republic. But we actually, whether consciously or not, need to spread bourgeois social relations to Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the difficult question of, well, does that mean smashing the Catholic Church in Ireland? Does that mean proscribing Catholicism?
Mm-hmm.
What is the relationship between the agricultural peasants in Ireland and the kind of early bourgeois English colonisers? And so there's this way in which Ireland is just sort of unavoidably bound up in the dynamic of the emergence of bourgeois society and the revolution in England. But then it comes to be seen as this kind of, that in the 18th century it's English liberalism which opposes Irish emancipation. So that the kind of the split within
Although there is
Whigs as a kind of, it's the same thing that happens with the American Revolution basically. And so I guess how do we deal with that? That kind of inexorable tension.
I mean, I suppose maybe a couple of points. I mean, firstly, if you will, one of the sort of, if you will, one of the key points to sort of take away from this is, the emergence of what I think I once described as two competing Anglo-Saxon liberalisms. I.e. that what persists then in Ireland after this, the politics of orange and green, as you might put it, is between, if you will, the sort of, these two competing sort of political manifestations of bourgeois society and bourgeois freedom, i.e. a sort of, most generously, Orangism is often taken to be very conservative, but the union, if you will, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland is a sort of, firstly, as I think I drew out, is a bourgeois sort of construct, and this drive towards, as you say, the universal within the bourgeois revolution, i.e. that you can achieve cooperation through commerce and trade, for the pursuit of your labour in this United Kingdom, which is one sort of political manifestation of bourgeois society, versus the later sort of French revolutionary sort of idea of this republican sort of independent nation in a sort of in the Brotherhood of Free Nations, as these two competing sort of claims to bourgeois freedom, which is important because that's sort of what persists then, even today in the sort of obviously in crisis, but that is sort of political, one of the sort of political political division, and I suppose just in what you're saying as well about the left. I mean, what's interesting is that you have the emergence of a left in with someone like Cromwell, but without the sort of consciousness of a left as such, which really comes later. You have this difference between Whigs and Tories, but it's only really later in the 18th century that you have this notion of a left and then of a right emerge. And Tory, I perhaps maybe might add, is actually a word that emerges in Ireland actually in the 1840s. It's a Gaelic word, which means outlaw or bandit, and to refer to royalists. And then I think, it becomes used then later on to refer to like royalists, i.e. like conservative sort of, Jacobites. But right,
but the issue of like Catholic emancipation splits like liberalism.
Right.
I mean, splits the Whigs.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, I mean, what's strange about like, like Catholic emancipation in that sense typically refers to like the, it's like the 19th century, whereas previously it was there was like a split, but it was the nature of if you were like the liberal sort of like opposition to excuse me, the argument like in favour in like the sort of second half of like the 18th century would have been obviously firstly that well, they're like industrious and sort of they work hard and so on and so forth, so what's the sort of i.e. that they're labouring, so what's the so there's like no like basis for this, which is universal. There's like no basis for this like
anti-Catholicism,
right? Or even it's also important to bear in mind the sort of anti like dissenter as well, but also the other problem is that, well, one of the interesting things is that while they are like peculiar to like bourgeois society, they were never in a sense like fully like enforced in one sense, even though given the sort of like the exacting nature of like the laws, you couldn't own like a horse over like £5, for example, which was like horses of like military like standard, but in large parts they're sort of not actually quite rigorously enforced, and then you have like someone like Edmund Burke sort of arguing essentially that, well, laws in that sense which aren't being enforced are obviously simply not expressive of like society, so to keep them is simply absurd. But then in like the 19th century, you really have, I think I mentioned, like the re-emergence of like religion as like this issue in a way that, I mean, this is maybe not so clear in Ireland, but more broadly had been sort of overcome by the bourgeois revolution. And again, in Ireland, this relates more to, but elsewhere, to the crisis of like labour. I don't know. Any other sort of? Chloe, have you?
This is a new period for me, a new area.
Yeah, it's.
I'm thinking about the geography of how all these things are working.
What are you thinking then?
No, I know you're saying that sometimes a lot of this like anti-Catholicism isn't enforced, and I was wondering how that's split up, if that's different in different parts of the country.
I mean, I think it's fairly, like uneven. It really depends, I think, on the particular, like, say, magistrate or whatever, as to how rigorously they would be like enforced. I mean, I think it would have been, less rigorously enforced in, the in the south and the west, where you would have had less like, proportionally you would have had less like settlers. So there was simply just a, they were like a very small number. And it was like partially just impractical to sort of carry them out. But I mean, I suppose the real sort of like impetus behind their like lack of enforcement is they're sort of they've already been like rendered sort of obsolete in a sense. But I don't know. I'm like, excuse me.
Should we pause for a break?
Yeah.
There's evident something to.
I mean, I was going to ask something about the emergence of like Irish nationalism as a thing, because you've been describing it, it seems like there's more. It's been motivated more by kind of the issue of Catholicism than it is of like Irish nationalism or Ireland as a kind of construct that people have rallied around. But I think that's something that might be getting to in the second thing of like, I guess, the question of national determination and the emergence of the idea of Ireland as a nation.
Well, I mean, I think it does sort of actually relate to the sort of stuff we were discussing, in the sense that it's Ireland as this like idea of like a nation. Excuse me again, does like emerge with the particularly the sort of like more radical, the United Irishmen. It does emerge in like the second half of like the 18th century, as it does like elsewhere. This notion of like the nation as a sort of like political like polity that, particularly in this case, can like express freedom like beyond sort of like denominational like issue.
So that's dissenters and Catholics
And Protestant.
and Protestants. But and Church of England Protestant.
Yeah. Well, that's I mentioned like you would have had like
You would have like liberal ascension.
ascendancy, like aristocrats, yes, like liberal, who would have also been like, in favour of, we're also United Irishmen. I mean, it's just partially that they just happen to be a much like proportionally smaller number just overall, and predominantly sort of aristocratic sort of landlords. But it is sort of, it sort of emerges in a sense with the bourgeois revolution, but then, in one sense, it like deepens in like the 19th century, but obviously in this like problematic way.
So it's like disaggregating the nation from nationalism, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I suppose the nation is this like bourgeois polity, but not in like crisis. Whereas nationalism, particularly, sort of then like emerges. It's like the crisis of like the nation. The reification even of the nation.
The ism in nationalism.
Right. The fact that you can no longer have like all of these like nations sort of engaging in like mutual sort of cooperation in this like bourgeois sense, like the brotherhood of free nations, but rather you have like the problem of like competing nationalisms under capitalism, is obviously that is sort of what then transpires.